You've embarrassed this family for the last time. My mother's voice didn't rise above conversation level, but it sliced through the room like broken glass. Her hands trembled as she reached for her wine glass. Half full of Cabernet, her fallback when words failed, but she didn't drink it. She just stared at me across the linen-covered table, her lips trembling as if my very presence offended her sense of order. I didn't answer. Not right away. What do you say to that? Sighed, the wind rattled the porch swing in its lazy chains, and inside, the china gleamed under the low light of the chandelier. We were 3 bites into dinner. Chicken piccata had gone cold. I stared at the plate in front of me, at the roasted carrots I'd helped slice an hour earlier in a desperate attempt to play the good daughter. But nothing could fix what had just happened. The air was thick with tension and unsaid things, the kind that accumulates over years of conditional love and quiet disappointments. My name is Mira Sutter. I'm 29 years old, and in the time it takes to ruin a family dinner, I became the cautionary tale my relatives would whisper about for the next 10 years. The silverware clinked as my younger cousin Zoe shifted in her seat. Even she, at 17, could tell something irreversible had just happened. My aunt tried to change the subject, weather, flights, the price of real estate, but no one was listening. My father sat motionless at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, the same way he looked when he lost a patient. Emotion was inefficient to him. Clouded judgment. He wasn't about to waste any on me. I had just told my family that I was no longer finishing med school. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the antique mantel clock behind me, the one my mother wound every Sunday as part of her rituals. Even time was judging me. "You walked away," she said finally, so quietly it felt like a secret she didn't want to admit out loud. "You had 1 year left, Mira." 1 year. "I know," I said, my voice so still it almost didn't feel like mine. And it would have been a lie. Every second of it. "You don't get to just change your mind because you're bored." Her voice cracked, but she quickly covered it with a sip of wine, blinking hard to keep the tears at bay. That was how she handled anything emotional, with grace under pressure, with posture, with restraint so fierce it bled into every room she entered. To my mother, chaos was weakness. And I had just set her entire identity on fire. What they didn't know, what I hadn't told them, was that I'd made this decision almost a year ago. I'd been going through the motions for months, dragging myself through rotations with a dead look in my eyes, submitting case reports with no soul behind them. I'd been lying to everyone, my professors, my friends, myself. Every day felt like I was betraying some future version of me I no longer believed in. But it wasn't until my psych rotation that it all cracked open. I remember standing outside the locked unit of St. Mary's Medical, holding a patient chart in one hand and a granola bar in the other, when it hit me. I had spent 6 years training to diagnose other people's crises, all while ignoring the one blooming inside my own chest. And now, here I was, facing the full weight of that truth, with no white coat to shield me. "I'm not bored," I said quietly. "I'm suffocating." My mother's face tightened. "You don't get to suffocate after everything we've given you." My cousin dropped her fork. No one picked it up. I felt something shift in my spine then, something cold and resolute. I had tried to ease them into this, to be respectful. I had waited months to say anything. I'd moved back home to soften the blow. But there was no soft way to tell people like my parents that you were walking away from everything they considered sacred. My mother stood slowly, folding her napkin with deliberate control. "You've embarrassed this family for the last time, Mira." Those words hung in the air like smoke. I stood too. Not in defiance, but in finality. Like I was stepping off a stage after the final curtain call. "I'm not embarrassed," I said. "And I'm not sorry." She didn't look at me. Not once. She just walked to the kitchen and began rinsing the untouched dishes, the ones I had helped set just hours ago when this was still a family dinner. I turned to my father, hoping stupidly that maybe he'd say something. Anything. But he only stared past me into the hallway as if I were already gone. And maybe I was. I left my plate, my coat, and the small white envelope with a graduation announcement they had ordered last year, still unopened. I didn't need it anymore. I stepped out into the October wind, pulling the door shut behind me with a quiet that felt louder than any slam. I had no plan. No savings to speak of. No backup degree. But what I did have for the first time in my life was this, the unmistakable silence that comes right after telling the truth. And it was beautiful. Growing up a Sutter in Portland was like being drafted into a private army, uniforms optional but expectations mandatory. We didn't talk about dreams. We talked about plans. Dreams were for children and artists. Plans got you into Duke, into Harvard, into medical school. Plans were safe. Structured. Plans had backup plans. My earliest memories weren't bedtime stories or playgrounds. They were waiting rooms. Hospitals. Dad pulling 36-hour shifts, Mom flipping through medical journals while dinner cooled on the counter. When other kids brought dolls to kindergarten, I brought a stethoscope and pretended to diagnose imaginary illnesses in imaginary friends. I thought it made me special. In truth, it made me trained. By the time I was 10, it was already assumed I'd go to medical school. Nobody asked if I wanted it. That was never part of the conversation. It was the air we breathed. My brother Julian had set the bar so high the rest of us couldn't see over it. First in his class, debate team captain, valedictorian, full ride to Stanford. He was the crown jewel, the golden child. And I was the one with empathy. The softer one. The daughter who memorized poetry and cried during animal rescue commercials. I didn't fit their mold, but I learned to fake it. I learned quickly that being gentle wasn't a strength in a house like ours. It was a liability you had to dress in excellence to be tolerated. So I did everything right. Honor roll. Pre-med at Whitman. Summer internships at hospitals I hated. Volunteering for surgical observation even though the sight of blood made my stomach clench. I told myself it would get better. That this was just part of the process, that med school would be different. More meaningful. More human. But the truth was, by the time I reached Emory, I already knew I was dying inside. It happened slowly. Like carbon monoxide poisoning, odorless, silent, invisible. I stopped writing. Stopped taking photos. Stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. Every day was a treadmill of clinical rotations, exams, and pretending to be interested in metabolic pathways I couldn't bring myself to care about. I wasn't burned out. I was hollow. Till I kept going. Because quitting wasn't an option. Quitting wasn't Sutter. It wasn't until my rotation at Ridgeview Psychiatric that the fracture finally broke open. We were doing intake assessments when a patient, a woman in her 50s with a blank stare and nicotine-stained fingers, looked right at me and said, "You don't want to be here, do you?" I laughed it off. My attending chuckled. But inside, something cracked. That night, I stayed in the on-call room long after my shift ended, staring at the ceiling like it held the answer to the question I was too afraid to ask. What if I wasn't supposed to be a doctor at all? It wasn't just that I hated the workload. I could survive exhaustion. What I couldn't survive was the lie. Truth was, I didn't believe in this path anymore. Not the hierarchy, not the grind, not the definition of success that required sacrificing every part of myself that felt human. When I finally told my parents I was taking a break, I framed it gently. I said it was a mental health pause. That I needed time to reflect. I thought maybe if I eased them into the idea they'd understand. They didn't. "You're just tired," my mother said. "Everybody gets tired. You don't walk away because of that." Dad didn't say much. Just gave me that look, tight-lipped, silent judgment. The same look he gave to residents who asked obvious questions during rounds. Disappointment disguised as restraint. For a while, I let them believe I'd go back. It was easier than trying to explain something they refused to understand. I moved back in. Helped around the house. got a part-time job at a local bookstore and said it was temporary. Every conversation circled the same drain. When was I returning to school? But behind closed doors, I was building something else. A vision I hadn't dared to speak aloud. A path that didn't require a lab coat or a scalpel, but instead a lens, a literal one. My camera, gathering dust for years, became my compass again. I started taking photos, shooting small documentary segments about underrepresented voices in the Pacific Northwest, migrant farm workers, LGBTQ youth, female-owned microbusinesses in forgotten towns. I uploaded one to a local storytelling platform. Then another. Then a third. People started noticing. One morning, I woke up to find an email from the Oregon Independent asking to feature one of my pieces in their digital docu series. It was about a Syrian refugee turned beekeeper in eastern Oregon. They called the piece Sweet Resistance. It had been watched 48,000 times in 2 days. That was the first time I felt alive in years. But I didn't tell my family. Not then. They still believed I was lost. That I was drifting. That I'd eventually come back to my senses. They didn't understand that I wasn't drifting, I was becoming. Becoming someone they didn't recognize. And that terrified them more than failure ever could. The bookstore where I worked was small, barely bigger than a 2-bedroom apartment, with scuffed hardwood floors and a bell that jingled every time someone walked in. The owner, Lenora, was in her 60s, an ex-editor from San Francisco who smoked clove cigarettes on the back patio and called everyone kid, regardless of age. "You look like someone who's finally outgrown her own skin," she told me one slow afternoon, while sorting poetry books from the donation bin. That's when the magic starts, you know. Right after the discomfort. I smiled like I understood, but I didn't. Not yet. It would be another 2 weeks before everything snapped. It happened, of all places, during dinner with my brother Julian. He was in town for a medical conference and had invited me to meet him at an upscale tapas place downtown. It was a calculated gesture, neutral ground, public setting, fewer chances for emotional fallout. I wore a black blouse I hadn't touched in months, trying to look more put together than I felt. We sat near a window, the rain pressing gently against the glass while the waitress brought us olives we didn't order and wine we couldn't pronounce. Julian had barely touched his food. "You've still got time," he said finally, after too many polite silences and 2 false starts. "You could reapply next year. It wouldn't even look bad. Just say you needed time to recalibrate." His tone was clinical, strategic, like I was a patient refusing treatment. "I'm not recalibrating," I said quietly. "I'm redirecting." Julian frowned. "Mira, you're talented. You're smart. You're compassionate. I'm not you," I cut in, sharper than I meant to. The words came out like glass in my mouth. He set his fork down. For once, the practiced diplomacy on his face cracked just a little. "You think I don't get it?" he asked. "You think I don't have days where I want to walk out of the ore and never come back?" I blinked, startled. I had never heard him say anything remotely like that. "But I stay," he continued, "because I owe it to everyone who got me here. I owe it to Mom and Dad. I owe it to the people who need me. And maybe you do too." I looked at him then, really looked. My brilliant, exhausted brother in a designer suit and dark circles under his eyes. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilt. I felt sorrow. For him. For me. For all the people who mistake sacrifice for purpose. "I'm not doing this to hurt anyone," I said. "But I can't live a life that isn't mine." He didn't answer. Just stared out the window like maybe the rain could explain me better than I ever could. That night I packed a bag. Not a dramatic suitcase with a broken zipper like the night I left home, just a gray backpack stuffed with 2 notebooks, my Canon camera, a change of clothes, and a folder with the pitch deck I'd spent the last 6 months building in secret. Because here's what I haven't told you yet. I had an idea. A real one. And for once, it didn't involve applying to something someone else had already built. Called it Threadlight, a digital storytelling platform dedicated to grassroots change, documenting community efforts around climate resilience, food security, refugee innovation. Short films, photography, first-person essays. A space for stories most people never hear from voices usually ignored. I had pitched it once, just once, at a local social entrepreneurship meetup in Portland. 5 people clapped. One of them, a former producer from KQED, asked me to send her a full proposal. I did. And now I was waiting to find out if this thing I'd been building in the quiet hours between family tension and minimum wage shifts actually meant something to someone besides me. I booked a one-way Amtrak to San Francisco. No return ticket. No apartment lined up. Just enough savings to last 3 months if I ate carefully and slept on couches. I left my keys on the bookstore counter with a note for Lenora that read, "You were right. The magic hurts a little. But I think I'm ready for it." Train left just after sunrise. As we pulled out of Union Station, I watched the Pacific Northwest fade behind me. Pine trees, gray skies, the skyline of a life I was done pretending to belong to. I was scared. Not brave, not empowered. Scared. But fear, I was learning, is just a sign that you're finally headed somewhere you haven't been told to go. And for once, I didn't need a map. I had a lens. I had a story. And it was mine. The first few weeks in San Francisco felt like free fall. Not the thrilling kind with wind in your face and adrenaline in your chest. The other kind, the disorienting drop into silence where your stomach stays clenched and your brain can't stop calculating the distance to rock bottom. I landed on a friend's couch in Bernal Heights. An old friend from undergrad, Sam, who worked at a local nonprofit and made exactly enough to keep their one-bedroom apartment and a cat named Broccoli alive. They welcomed me like family and refused to let me pay rent. Still, I felt the weight of being someone's guest in a city I couldn't afford to live in. I spent my days bouncing between shared co-working spaces and coffee shops with weak Wi-Fi, cobbling together edits on my camera, scribbling new content ideas into a tattered notebook, and sending email after email into the void. I pitched Threadlight to 14 different community media funds, microgrant platforms, and early-stage social venture firms. 14. I heard back from 8. All were rejections. Most of them polite. A few painfully detailed, full of concerns about scalability and lack of institutional traction. One even suggested I consider partnering with a more experienced founder. I kept them all in a folder on my laptop labeled Fuel. I told myself that every no was just clearing space for the right yes. But some nights that sounded more like therapy speak than truth. Sam tried to stay encouraging, even when I started calculating how many more weeks I could survive on instant ramen and tap water. One night, they came home to find me curled up on the living room rug, surrounded by grant paperwork and half-finished editing timelines. "You know you're allowed to rest, right?" they said, stepping over a pile of crumpled Post-it notes. I didn't answer. Because I didn't believe it. I wasn't allowed to rest. Not after walking away from everything. Not after the dinner with my mother, the silence from my father, the look on Julian's face when I told him this wasn't a phase. If I failed now, I wouldn't just be broke. I'd be proven wrong. That was the part no one tells you about choosing your own path. It means no one else can be blamed if you trip on it. Till something kept me going. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was that tiny flicker inside that hadn't gone out, even after being drowned in other people's expectations for years. I worked. I worked like hell. I built a pilot series from scraps, borrowed gear, public domain music, and one incredibly patient farm worker cooperative in Modesto that let me film their food sovereignty project in exchange for homemade granola bars and a $50 grocery card. I shot, edited, narrated, subtitled, and uploaded the series in a week. I called it Stories That Feed Us. Got 211 views in its first 3 days. Then 400. Then, without warning, 18,000. Turned out a climate equity newsletter had embedded the video in a weekend digest. Then a teacher in Vermont shared it with her civics class. Then a podcast picked it up. One morning, I woke up to an email with the subject line, "We've been watching your work." It was from Carmen Vega, the head of community partnerships at a venture-backed impact studio called Horizon Echo. She'd seen the pilot. Said it reminded her of early Kiva campaigns, but with better lighting and an actual soul. She wanted to talk. We scheduled a Zoom call that same week. I wore my only clean blazer, sat in front of a bookshelf that wasn't mine, and tried to sound like someone who hadn't eaten instant oatmeal for the third day in a row. Carmen didn't waste time. "We think there's something here," she said. Threadlight feels like the kind of media people are hungry for, raw, honest, and grounded in real communities. I tried to steady my voice. Honestly, it's been hard to get people to take it seriously. "Well," she smiled, "that changes today. We're offering you a $100,000 seed grant and 6 months in our residency program. Full creative control, production support, mentorship, and access to our network of funders. If you want it." I couldn't speak. I just nodded. Then laughed. Then cried a little. Carmen didn't flinch. "We're used to that reaction," she said. "But get ready. Your life is about to change." And it did. Not overnight. Not all at once. But the world tilted. I signed the paperwork the next day. Sam bought a bottle of cheap Prosecco and made a toast in chipped mugs. I got my own corner desk at the Horizon Echo co-working loft in the Mission and cried the first time I plugged my camera into a charger that didn't overheat. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of my tiny sublet, I realized something strange. It still hurt that my family didn't know. That they weren't proud. That they thought I was lost when I'd never been closer to finding myself. But for the first time, their silence didn't feel like a prison. Felt like distance. And I was learning to breathe in it. 6 months later, I stood on a rooftop in Oakland, surrounded by a small film crew, staring through the viewfinder of my camera as the sun dipped below the skyline. My boots were dusty, my flannel rolled to the elbows, and my name, Mira Sutter, was printed on a press badge clipped to my jacket. Somewhere below, the community garden team we'd spent the afternoon filming passed around paper plates of tamales and sweet rice. Laughter carried through the alleyways. A baby cried in the distance. A drone hovered low to capture the final wide shot. The air smelled like sage and pavement and something else I hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. Threadlight had launched officially 2 months earlier. What had started as grainy footage in farm fields was now a growing ecosystem of short documentaries, photo essays, and first-person micronarratives from the kinds of places funders usually skipped over. Crowdfunding campaigns. Free-to-access school curriculum packs. A web series in development about solar-powered refugee kitchens in Arizona. We'd published 18 projects in 9 states and 3 countries. More than 300,000 people had engaged with our work. I had been interviewed twice, once on a local NPR affiliate and once for a digital issue of Medium's Women Who Build series. The photo they used was one Sam had taken of me squatting in front of a field camera, eating almonds with one hand while exporting footage with the other. It wasn't glamorous. None of it was. But it was real. And that was enough. What I hadn't done, not once, was tell my parents. They still thought I was taking time. Still believed I was somewhere between lost and reapplying. My mother had stopped asking entirely. Julian, when he called, kept his tone light and impersonal, as if any direct question might trigger the truth neither of us knew how to hold. It wasn't shame keeping me quiet. It was strategy. I wanted the reveal to matter. Not just as a defense, but as a declaration. I wasn't going to explain myself half-heartedly on a tense phone call or while passing the salt across a table built on silence. When the moment came, I wanted them to see it, not guess, not doubt. In some small part of me, I still wanted to be recognized. But not for the career they planned, but for the person I'd become despite it. That person, it turned out, was building something worth noticing. Horizon Echo had renewed their commitment to Threadlight, tripling our funding for the following year. A private donor had just pledged a six-figure grant to support our international stories. 2 of our short films had been accepted into a documentary festival in Santa Fe. And a progressive corporate partner, a clean tech company from Seattle, was in talks to underwrite a 10-part series on indigenous water rights. I should have been overwhelmed. Instead, I felt like I'd just arrived. There was one day that stands out. I was sitting in a midtown conference room with brushed steel walls and floor-to-ceiling windows, pitching Threadlight's upcoming slate to a room full of climate tech investors. One of them, a woman in her 50s with sharp glasses and a sharper voice, asked me directly, "How did you get here? Your bio said you were on track to become a doctor." I paused, took a slow breath, and then I said the truth, the whole truth, for the first time out loud in a room full of people who didn't know me at all. "I walked away," I said, "'cause I was chasing someone else's dream. And I chose to build my own instead." There was a beat of silence. Then she nodded once, scribbled something in her notebook, and said, "Smart." Took everything in me not to laugh. Because there, in that polished high-rise space full of people who judged you on traction and burn rate, I just said the one thing my family had always considered the height of betrayal, and been validated for it. Later that week, Forbes reached out. They were putting together a spotlight on emerging women-led media ventures focused on social impact. Someone from Horizon Echo had passed along my name. They wanted a full profile, with photos. I sat on the email for 3 hours. Then I said yes. I wore no makeup to the shoot. Insisted on natural light. Took them to the community-run cafe where Threadlight hosted editing workshops once a month. I brought my camera and filmed a side segment about the barista who built the cafe after losing her job during the pandemic. The photographer later told me, "You're a quiet storm." That line stayed with me. When the article ran 2 weeks later, I didn't send it to my family. But I knew they'd find it. 'Cause someone always finds Forbes. Thanksgiving came quietly that year. A group email had gone out, subject line, "Family Meal Plan," and my mother had signed it warmly Eleanor, as if she were coordinating a small non-profit fundraiser instead of inviting her children home for the holiday. I hadn't planned to go. I'd come up with every excuse in advance: production deadlines, grant submissions, and out-of-town shoot. But when Julian called, his voice tired but honest, I heard something in him I hadn't heard since we were kids. "Just come," he said. "Even if it's awkward. Especially if it is." So I booked the flight. Quietly. Privately. No big announcement. No lead-up. Just a decision I made one Tuesday evening between sending footage notes to a sound editor and heating lentil soup in a ceramic mug. When I landed in Portland, the air hit me with that familiar pine-soaked chill. My rideshare driver played classic jazz on low volume and didn't ask a single question. It was a mercy I didn't know I needed. The house looked the same. Gray clapboard siding. Maroon shutters. Porch light already on, casting a warm glow against the gathering dusk. I stood there for a few seconds before ringing the bell, wondering if stepping inside would make me 17 again, unsure of my voice and hoping I wouldn't say the wrong thing. Julian answered the door. "You actually came," he said, grinning. "I told Mom you wouldn't. She owes me $20. We hugged, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel performative. Felt like siblings. Like people who had been through something separately but survived it together anyway. Inside, the table was already set. Crystal water glasses, linen napkins, gold-rimmed plates, the kind my mother only used for real holidays. She emerged from the kitchen in a deep green sweater, carrying a roasting dish with both hands. "Mira," she said simply, setting it down. "You look well." It wasn't warmth. But it wasn't ice either. And that, from Eleanor Sutter, was practically a standing ovation. Dinner started like a truce. Polite questions. Safe topics. How was the weather in San Francisco? Was I still taking time off? Did I miss the hospital? I answered carefully, dodging direct confrontation the way one might dodge a conversation with a sleeping bear, slowly, quietly, and with minimal eye contact. Then came the moment. It always comes. We were halfway through dessert, pecan tart store-bought because my mother no longer trusted anyone with the family pie crust recipe, when she said it. "So, Mira," she began, cutting her slice with surgical precision. "Have you made a decision about medical school yet?" Table went still. Julian looked down at his plate. My aunt cleared her throat. The heater hummed in the background, the only sound for a full 3 seconds. I didn't flinch this time. "I'm not going back," I said as gently as I could. "I withdrew a year and a half ago." A pause. Then, permanently, "Yes." My mother's fork hit the edge of her plate with a soft clink. "And what, exactly, are you doing instead?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand. I looked her in the eye. Then at my father, who had remained silent the entire meal. Then at Julian, who gave me the smallest, almost imperceptible nod of support. "I started a media company," I said. "We tell grassroots stories, climate justice, food equity, refugee resilience. We've reached over 300,000 people. We're fully funded through grants and social impact investors." Silence. Then, from the end of the table, my aunt, "Wait, Threadlight? That's yours." My mother blinked. "You've heard of it?" "Everyone at the office's been sharing that video about the Navajo Solar Tech Project. It was on the Guardian's homepage last week." I kept my voice calm. "We just signed a syndication deal with Horizon Echo. I was profiled in Forbes last month." My father finally looked at me. Not with pride. Not yet. But not with disappointment either. With confusion. "This is real?" he asked. "This isn't some detour?" "No," I said. "It's the road." My mother stood. Walked to the sink. Ran water for a plate that didn't need cleaning. "Why didn't you tell us?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I tried," I said more softly now. "But every time I came close, I remembered how you looked at me when I left. Like I'd failed you. Like I'd failed myself." She didn't turn around. But I saw her shoulders fall. "I thought you were throwing it all away," she said. "Everything we gave you. Everything you were becoming." "I wasn't becoming anything," I said. "I was disappearing." No one spoke. Then Julian cleared his throat. "Myra's the keynote speaker at the Horizon Equity Forum next month. You should come. The whole family." My mother turned, drying her hands with a cloth she didn't need. She didn't say yes. But she didn't say no either. And for the first time, that felt like enough. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, I stood backstage at the Horizon Equity Forum in San Francisco, wearing a slate-colored jumpsuit and holding a microphone in hands that didn't tremble anymore. The room beyond the velvet curtain buzzed with quiet anticipation. Activists, funders, educators, community organizers, reporters. 1,000 faces, and none of them asking me if I was ever going to finish med school. They already knew who I was. I heard my name. Not the way my mother used to say it, tight with worry. Not the way my father used it like a warning. But with clarity and respect. "Please welcome the founder and creative director of Threadlight Media, Mira Sutter." Applause followed. I stepped onto the stage and didn't shrink. I told them about the woman in the refugee camp who built her own Wi-Fi tower out of repurposed copper and bamboo. About the farmer in North Carolina who taught kids how to grow food and film it at the same time. About the nurse in Albuquerque who became a climate educator on TikTok, reaching more students with her phone than she ever could in a classroom. I told them what I'd never had the courage to tell my family at first. That storytelling wasn't just important. It was survival. It was the record we leave behind for those who don't get invited to write history books. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Afterward, as I stepped off stage and into the hallway, I caught sight of a familiar silhouette by the exit. My mother. Not dressed in her usual composed perfection, but in flats and a simple navy coat. She stood still, as if unsure whether to approach. Her eyes were red, not from tears, I suspected, but from watching me through a screen big enough to make everything seem a little more real. We didn't hug. We didn't fall into each other's arms in a scripted movie moment. She just reached out, touched my sleeve, and said, "You were never a disappointment." I wanted to believe it. I think part of me did. But the rest of me, older now, quieter and finally whole, didn't need her words to be true. I had already built a life on a truth far stronger than her validation. That's the thing they don't tell you about healing. Sometimes the wound closes before the apology comes. That winter, Threadlight expanded into Latin America. We signed a bilingual distribution deal with a regional network in Chile. Our footage aired in public schools across Argentina, Bolivia, and Costa Rica. I gave a talk at the United Nations Foundation about ethical documentary practices and the limits of Western saviorism. My inbox flooded with young creators asking how I started. I always answered honestly. I started by leaving. I started by not asking permission. I started by walking away from a life that looked good on paper but hollowed me out in private. I moved into a quiet loft in Potrero Hill. A space filled with warm wood, houseplants I didn't kill, and a worn black couch where I sometimes fell asleep editing past midnight. Sam still came by every week, now serving as Threadlight's editorial advisor and chief tea bringer. My father hadn't said much since the forum. But one day a package arrived. It was a first edition copy of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, the James Agee classic he used to keep on his bookshelf when I was a child. Inside, a sticky note with 5 words in his handwriting. "You're doing holy work, Mira." I didn't frame it. I didn't cry. I just placed it between my notebooks, next to a plane ticket to Mexico City for our next field project. Sometimes people ask if I feel vindicated. If the success, the articles, the invitations to speak, the grants, all of it feels like revenge for what I went through. And the truth is, no. Feels like peace. Because the best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's building a life where you no longer need to. It's waking up, opening your laptop, and knowing that the work waiting for you wasn't handed down or assigned, but chosen. Chosen by the version of you that finally courageously listened to your own voice. And trusted it.